Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. Just a quick reminder, there's a disclaimer at the end of the show that's important for you to listen to. Hey, for all of you out there who have heard of the MIB team, the Market Intelligence Branch, you can get the research my MIB team does on issues from sharp price movements in the futures markets to block trades to LNG's impact on the natural gas markets by going to our website at cftc.gov, click on the Market Data and Analysis button, and then click on Staff Reports. And yes, I realize this is a bit of a web scavenger hunt, but it's worth it. And I'm really happy with the work that the MIB team has done and will continue to do on these topics and issues relevant to the markets we regulate. Today, we have a very special guest. It's not often on CFTC Talks we get to have a Nobel Prize winner on the show, but today we have one. Robert J. Shiller is the Sterling Professor of Economics, Department of Economics, and Cowles Foundation for Research in Economics, Yale University, and Professor of Finance and Fellow at the International Center for Finance, Yale School of Management. He received a BA from the University of Michigan in 1967 and his PhD in economics from MIT in 1972. Now, he has written on the financial markets, financial innovation, behavioral economics, macroeconomics, real estate, statistical methods, and on public attitudes, opinions, and moral judgments regarding the markets. Some of his books include Irrational Exuberance, also Subprime Solution, How the Global Financial Crisis Happened and What to Do About It, and Animal Spirits, How Human Psychology Drives the Economy and Why It Matters for Global Capitalism. He writes a regular column, Finance in the 21st Century, for Project Syndicate, which is published around the world, and of course, Economic View for the New York Times. He has numerous awards, but I think the one that would jump out to most of us and most of you is that he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences jointly with Eugene Fama and Lars Peter Hansen in 2013. Dr. Shiller, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Hi.
Bobby, it's really great to have you on this podcast today, and we're going to focus a bit on your paper that you published in January of 2017 called Narrative Economics, or the Narratives Relevant to Economic Fluctuations. And to me, this is exciting work and something I think I've been trying to do for most of my career, and something I do now for the CFTC is understanding and dissecting the economic, or what we call market narratives, driving values to help us understand the commodity markets like corn and soybeans, as well as interest rates. And what's interesting to me is at the beginning of the paper, you make the point that in the research that the human brain has always been highly tuned towards narratives, whether factual or not, to justify ongoing actions, even such basic actions as spending and investing. So for our audience, let's start there with the basics by explaining what you mean by narrative economics.
Well, you've done a good job of introducing it. Actually, I think of this as economics returning to some wisdom from other social sciences. All of the others are more inclined to use sociology, anthropology, psychology, political science. They're all more attuned to narratives. I think that it had become kind of a taboo among economists. The idea that economics is the queen of the social sciences because it's based on a mathematical discipline.
Right.
That idea, it doesn't flatter people who are pure mathematical economists to say the narratives are driving things. So it's been considered kind of lowbrow.
Right.
And that's, although some economists do pay attention to narratives, maybe the more journalistic economists. But I think it's going to change. It's starting to change.
Well, to me, I guess maybe part of the challenge here is to deal with, as you talk about in the paper, that there's a problem perhaps with reverse causality of the problem between changing narratives and economic outcomes, or the outcomes driving the narratives. How do you deal with that? I mean, I guess take a look at.
This is a fundamental problem in economics, inferring causality. because, as was pointed out over 100 years ago, we find it difficult to do controlled experiments. So, for example, a drug company wanting to test a new drug will formulate a bottle containing the drug and another one called a placebo, and then divide randomly subjects into experimental and control group and give one the placebo and the other the real drug. That kind of work can really establish whether the drug works. But we're not going to do that with fiscal policy or monetary policy.
I think there'd be some people angry about that.
So we can't do controlled experiments. But the idea that there's some way of dealing with this inability to do experiments has also some validity. You can infer something. Philosophers will debate what causality even means. But there are times when in the case of narratives, one thing that we can say is that outside of economics, there have been many controlled experiments showing that narratives have a real potential to shape human thinking and motivation. Marketing, we have marketing departments. They sit in a different building from the economics department. But in the marketing department, they know that narratives sell, and they have proof that it does. So that's why advertisements typically take the form of a narrative. They know. So if it works in marketing, why wouldn't it work in economics? Why wouldn't narratives have an impact on the way people make economic decisions?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. You brought in advertising and branding. Certainly spend so much time on focusing on what resonates, what the narrative, what story you're telling to get people to understand your brand, and then, of course, to identify with it. So it really permeates so many other parts of the economy. You'd think that more economic research would be done on this. But before we get to the math, and I think the math is really interesting in the paper for a number of reasons, but I think it may be a good idea to spend a little bit of time discussing what you describe as a gem for conversation when it comes to why a narrative has legs or can go viral.
Well, the human species is the only species with real language. The vervet monkeys have a few words. They can actually shout to each other warnings, but they can't tell a story. And this is really the human, I don't know, it's so deeply built into our brains that we tell stories. Neuroscientists can confirm that. We have a brain that is story-oriented. And our meaning of life is built around. Everyone has a story of himself or herself, usually as a hero of one sort or another. We aspire to be heroes. And those ultimately drive our decision-making.
And I think that's true. I mean, it's wonderful. I love how you bring in all of the other sciences, all of the social sciences into this. But I do want to get to the research that you did with the economic narrative specific. But how does one start with, where do you begin to start to look into which narratives that you wanted to research? Specifically, and how did you do that? Like, which storylines or which ones did you think were important to begin with?
Well, I did a lot of reading, and not just scholarly journals. You have to look for the dumb ideas. Some of them are dumb. And I also like to read newspapers because they're daily, and now you can find them. Now they're digitized, going back to way back. 1700s or more, and I like to read them because they're time-stamped. You know exactly what day they came out and what they mentioned. And often they bring up things that you would never have imagined they were thinking about back then. But some typically built around a story that, or multiple, I call them constellations of narratives. I'm writing a book about this now, so I'm continuing to develop these ideas. But narratives often are grouped around a theme. So, for example, in the Great Depression, there were many narratives in the 1930s about machines replacing jobs. There was an epidemic of that narrative because it helped them to explain the unemployment rate. Most people have forgotten that they thought that in the 30s. We think that it's some failure to stimulate the lack of invention of Keynesian stimulus that caused the Depression. But they didn't think of it that way, or some of them did, I suppose, but most of them didn't.
Well, and I think that's that's a great point. I mean, we still see some of those themes today that, you know, robots are coming to replace jobs.
Oh yeah, it's a
right?
new. These are what I call recurrent economic narratives. They come back. They will be forgotten for a while, but they have a certain contagiousness. And when things change, so what we've had since the financial crisis, we've had some stunning developments in artificial intelligence, notably computers that talk, like Siri or Alexa or OK Google. Right?
Right.
You can joke with them. You can ask them anything. They're amazing. And then we have the driverless cars, and now they're talking about driverless ships that will go across the ocean with cargo and nobody on the ship. These stories are, I think, particularly impressive. So it's rekindling the old technological unemployment story. Not the word. We don't call it technological unemployment, but it's the same idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so much fun hearing you talk about reading a lot. And I think for myself as a researcher, I think it's so much fun to go down rabbit holes, right? All these different things, especially in literature. And I loved in the paper that you talked about and referenced the 7 basic storylines of all literature. That happens to be a book that I picked up when I was diving into doing branding and thinking about branding overall. So that was really fun. But you make the point that we should be wise to add some analysis of what people are talking about if we are to search for the source of economic fluctuations and to think about how these narratives ought to be more informing of policy actions now and in the future. And I think that's a wonderful point. Let me just segue into, so let's get into the math a little bit right now. I personally love that you thought to use epidemic models in your analysis, because I've studied these as disease outbreaks and their impacts on the market, like SARS and what happened as that cascaded through the world. But Bob, dive into why this works for economic narratives.
Well, because narratives are, well, first of all, you have to appreciate that word of mouth is especially important and influential in people's thinking. But it's not just word of mouth, it's also our news media that generally they like to, on television, they like to simulate a normal conversation. Advertisers, when they're advertising a drug, they won't have a scientist explaining the statistical measures of success.
No.
They'll have someone who looks like your neighbor who's just talking to you over the backyard fence.
Right.
He says, I took it and it helped me.
Right.
Now, you'd think the public would know that that's not a reliable way to evaluate a drug.
True. One would hope.
But see, it's the interpersonal. You meet eyes with someone, you're standing close to them, you have a feeling of friendship, and that is very influential on thinking. So it's contagion of a different form than in disease epidemics, but it is contagion nonetheless.
So how does this work when you've applied this to social epidemics?
Well, first of all, I don't think that my work is largely a call for more research, and I don't have the definitive answers. I think in the next 10, 20, 30 years, as digital databases become more and more effective, and we have semantic search that allows you to trace through meanings rather than just arbitrary words, we'll know a lot more. But I'm still able to identify narratives that look causal, and it's just fun to try to put oneself in the frame of mind of someone at another time in history. And what you have to explain to explain economic fluctuations, recessions, or depressions, is why people would curtail their spending at some point of time. Now, of course, they might curtail their spending because they're unemployed or they have less business. That's the Keynesian model, but it's not just the Keynesian model. They also curtail their spending because of some narrative that scares them or makes them feel that prudence is desired right now. And it doesn't have to be that big an impact on their spending to bring on a recession.
Yeah,
once you take into account the Keynesian repercussions.
Right. I liked how you walked through the 1920-21 incredibly sharp recession that occurred back then. And maybe for our audience, you could just kind of, in following up on what you just said, like what were a few things that were going on socially that were interesting that drove that recession to be so sharp?
Okay, it's good to put it in historical perspective. It came right after World War I, which ended in 1918, at the end of 1918, and the influenza epidemic,
right,
which killed more people than the whole World War. So people were on edge. And also, during the war, U.S. corporations made a lot of money selling arms and other things related to the war. And they invented a new word, profiteer, to describe them. So they are feeling damaged. They've lost family members. They're angry and upset. And then what happens? After the war is over, somehow the Federal Reserve, which was brand new, they'd just been founded in 1914, they messed up and they caused one of the biggest inflations ever. Prices doubled from 1913 to 1920. And people were, now this is a new thing, inflation under our new central bank. They got upset again. So one thing that happened during the 1920-21 recession is that people were very angry against business. And they thought, I'm not going to spend money now. And they've started boycotting. Some of them, not everyone, but a lot of people did. And that helped bring on the... And then as prices were falling, they started to think, well, we're getting back to, President Harding called it normalcy. And they thought that meant now under President Harding that it will be a mass deflation back to 1913 levels. So they postponed purchasing. Nobody wanted to buy now if they think prices are going down.
Right.
And that lasted, it ended kind of quickly. The prices did come down quite a bit. And somehow there were appeals to spend more, and it ended. It's a little bit hard to know exactly why it started and stopped when it did, but I can place these narratives as of fundamental importance.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking back to when flat screens first came out, right, and how expensive they were. And I remember neighbors, some people getting them, and I was thinking, gosh, I really want to buy one, but everyone kept saying they're going to come down in price. Right, so I kept putting off the purchase, right, as long as I could. And then finally I bought one. But I think that must have been part of that narrative, right, back in the 20s.
I think it was quite strong. It was the smart shopper narrative. You're not going to be the sucker who pays these high prices that these profiteers are charging us. So it was both moral. Another thing about narratives is they help inform our moral sense. Typically, stories have a moral to them, and they're especially contagious if they do. So there was moral indignation, but not... it was tempered. It was an American style here because there was also a communist scare. And there were those people in Russia who put up the Tsar and his whole family, including children, before a firing squad. That was viewed very harshly here in America. So we firmly decided we are not communists. But we're angry at the profiteers nonetheless. So it left us with nothing to do. We're not going to have a revolution, but we're not going to buy anything either.
Interesting how those are conflated together. Fascinating. One of the things I loved about the research is you used Google Ngrams and Procast article counts to track the incidences of narratives. Maybe you could just walk us through, what did you find for the 2007-2009 financial crisis with that?
Yes. Well, the thing that preceded that crisis was a real estate boom.
Sure.
And the origins of that boom are a little bit elusive. Interest rates had been coming down. That's what economists would tend to bring up. They've been coming down for decades, but why suddenly was there a boom in home prices in the United States? And I think it had to do with narratives about running out of land, about housing has always been the best investment. That was actually a rather new theory, but informed by the rising prices. There was a whole atmosphere of that time, which hasn't, by the way, completely disappeared. It may be coming back. There's what Dan McGinn called housing lust, or voyeurism.
Wow.
We started to, we could get on various websites, you could get the price of some neighbor's house, and you find out how much it's really worth. So people started to judge people on the size of their house, not just rich people. Before, if you go back to the 1930s, say, people used to talk about keeping up with the Joneses. Who are the Joneses? Well, it sounds like your neighbors, right?
Right.
You're not keeping up with, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford. But now we kind of developed a set of thinking. We were more prosperous time. Some people were buying houses with really spectacular features, cathedral ceilings and the like. I think it became a national preoccupation to look at houses and think about what they're doing and what they're worth. And it was associated with advancing one's status. I think it parallels the extreme effort some people take to put their children in a elite college. So you wanted to live in an elite neighborhood and send your kid to an elite college. It ties into other narratives too. I think that was already percolating in the background was fear of losing one's job to a machine. So you couldn't think of putting your kid into an assembly line work at a factory.
Right.
That used to be okay. Now it's not, and it looks so threatened. So it's a whole ambiance of fascination with home. It's not just opinions, it's fascinations and stories. There are lots of stories of people who flipped their homes. This is just before the financial crisis. Sure. The flippers were sharp operators who bought a house, fixed it up a little bit, put it on the market again in 6 months, and made a huge profit. So these stories, they had a powerful impact.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of what we've seen with the virtual currencies, what we call FOMO, or fear of missing out, right? And that drove a lot of interest in it. Would that be a good narrative? Fascinating. I mean, you've written on bubbles and things like that. Right. I assume this is just a rich, fertile ground for you and applying the narrative economics.
Yeah, I'm actually going to. I think I'll feature the Bitcoin story in my book version of this. The Bitcoin was an invention of computer scientists that is kind of obscure. I mean, hard to understand. Mm-hmm. But it got much. So it's impressive. Whether it's our future is very doubtful. But it's impressive. They got so far with it that the total value of Bitcoin reached over $300 billion. When it was out of nowhere. It was just a computer program. Amazing. So it's an amazing story. People like amazing stories. The story, though, had other aspects to it that made it more contagious. whoever started Bitcoin deserves congratulations for having seen the importance of the Satoshi Nakamoto story. So how did Bitcoin get started? Back, I think it was 2008, on a blog, there was an article signed by Satoshi Nakamoto about how to start Bitcoin. I don't think he called it Bitcoin yet. And then Satoshi Nakamoto was emailing people, apparently, about, let's get this started. And somehow a Bitcoin.org got established, and they set up the program. But the people there, they never met Satoshi Nakamoto.
Right.
And where is he? Nobody has been able to find. There were people who were thought to be or claiming to be Satoshi Nakamoto. But that's a great story.
It is.
It's kind of like the Mona Lisa story. Nobody remembers it. The Mona Lisa became famous. It was somewhat famous, but it became really famous after 1910, when the painting was stolen from the Louvre in Paris. And there were several years of repetition of the Mona Lisa story. So it became the most famous painting in the world. Why? Because it was stolen. They kept trying to get the guy, and everyone was trying to figure out where it is, and they finally got it back.
Right.
But is that really so great a painting? Of course not. I mean, it's a nice painting. I would like it. But it's not. That's not why it's famous. It's famous because of the stories that developed around it. Oh, also, Mona Lisa's smile. Sigmund Freud made much of that. There was something about her smile, supposedly. If you believe that, I don't know.
I just started reading the book on Da Vinci, so I'm excited to get through that. That's my summer read for this year. But
he was indeed a remarkable person.
He was. There's a lot of interesting things going on there. See, we're going down a rabbit hole. This is really fun. Well, let me wrap this up by saying, where would you like to go forward from here? I mean, what are the opportunities for research on narrative economics? I realize you're reading a book, but I'm sure there's other things that you're thinking about.
Well, yeah. First of all, we need to be more systematic, but we can't eliminate human judgment. Not at this time. We can't be just reliant on searches of digitized things. So I think you have to do both. You have to quantify by counting articles, but you also have to read them and try to understand what they were saying. I'm focused on books and newspapers, but there are other kinds of digitized sources like diaries, sermons, advertisements, law cases, where you can get further insights. The one thing I'm stressing in my book version of this is that often the narratives that are formative of economic behavior are not among the top narratives. The top narratives are probably about the antics of some movie star, singer or something, and they may not have much economic influence.
Right.
So it's not, you have to look for things that might affect someone's decision to spend or invest or to hire, things like that affect economics. I think that I think of the big data revolution as analogous to the revolution in national income accounting and index numbers that occurred around the time of the Great Depression. With the Great Depression, they started focusing on GDP, national income, consumer price index, stock price indexes. People didn't talk about indexes except experts until then. So there was a data revolution, and it affected generations of economists. But I think we're having a new data revolution now with digitized databases of human interaction, and that will eventually change the whole atmosphere of the economics and finance profession.
Author, researcher, and Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Shiller, thank you for coming on the show today. This has been delightful.
All right, my pleasure.
Great.
That's our show for this week. Remember, you can get access to all the shows we do here by either going to our website at cftc.gov or by getting out your phone, clicking on the podcast app, and typing in CFTC Talks. Click subscribe if you want to get them every week. I'm Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. Thanks for listening. This has been CFTC Talks.
But wait, we're not done yet. It's time for a disclaimer. The CFTC is providing this information as a public service, and it is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or any third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in this podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provide similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guests in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated or referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing its interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting possible outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult an attorney.